Assalamualaikum. Today, we're going to discuss the seventh and the last chapter of the second edition of the book, Semiotics: The Basics of Danielle Chandler, The Prospect and the Retrospect. In this, we're going to tackle about the possibility of some future events in semiotics that may occur and the reviews of the past course of events during the rise and development of semiotics. But note that this is more on retrospect. The past reporters already discussed about the definition of semiotics, the theories, and of course the people behind or involved in this study.
Semiotics is everywhere, right? That is why it is very interesting to learn about semiotics. So if you are studying semiotics, it is important for you to know that the definition, scope, and the methodologies of semiotics vary from theories to theories. And it is also important for you to know that you have to be clear of whose version are you dealing with. By the way, I am Ajeba Mayraj Nasarawang, your reporter for today, and I am going to discuss about the prospect and retrospect.
In linguistics, structuralism is a general theory of culture and methodology that implies that elements of human culture must be understood by the way of their relationship to a broader system. It works to uncover the structures that underlie all the things that humans do, think, perceive, and feel. In fact, structuralism maintains that practically everything we do that is specifically human is expressed in language. Structuralists believe that these language symbols extend far beyond written or oral communication. Semiotics has become closely identified with structuralist approaches, but it is not tied to any particular theory or methodology. The current review has focused primarily on the European tradition deriving from Saussure, although we have also taken account of the impact of the Persian approach within this tradition. Saussure's framework was thus dismantled not only by the deconstructionists such as Derrida, but also by the structuralist linguist Jacobson. Yet, even from the ruins of the crumbling creation which bears Saussure's name, valuable concepts have still been salvaged. Jacobson commented, Saussure's course is the work of the genius, and even its errors and contradictions are suggestive. Radical arbitrariness of signs is a central property of a natural language that was emphasized in early European structuralism, especially by Ferdinand de Saussure. Linguistic signs are arbitrary insofar as there is no direct link between the signifiant and the signifier of a sign. It was another structuralist linguist and semioticians who argue that the radical arbitrariness of a sign advocated by Saussure was an illusory dogma. Saussure did in fact allude to relative arbitrariness. However, this potentiality was little more than a footnote in his exposition of the first principle of design, and as we have seen, it was through the influence of Peirce that this concept gained widespread acceptance. Saussure's emphasis on arbitrariness was based on his adoption of language as his model for semiotic systems. Subsequent structuralists sought to apply verbal language as a model to media which are nonverbal or not solely or primarily verbal. Such attempts at the unifying approach were seen by critics as failing to allow for the diversity of media. A key example of the problem identified by critics is that analogical images cannot be unproblematically reduced to discrete and meaningfully recombinable units in the way that verbal language can. Yet, some semioticians have insisted that a grammar can nevertheless be recognized at some level of analysis in visual and audiovisual media. In the case of the indexical medium such as photography, common sense suggests that we are dealing with a message without a code. According to Roland Barthes, that photography involves both mechanical reduction and human intervention. However, photography does not involve rule-governed transformation as codes can. In the photograph, the relationship of a signified and signifier is not one of the transformation but of recording. Alluding to the indexical nature of the medium, he notes that the image is captured mechanically and that this reinforces the myth of its objectivity. Unlike a drawing or a painting, a photograph reproduces everything. It cannot intervene with the object. There is no necessity to set up a code between the object and its image. In consequence, he noted, photographs cannot be reduced to words. Therefore, codes are not in the images but in people's perception of things. Images can be understood differently by different people regardless of what actually the paintings or images want to convey. For example, in this picture, we can see a child crying and having no shirt in a white background. In this, we can create different interpretations, such as a child is crying in the living room because he is hungry. A child is crying in the bathroom because his mom is forcing him to take a bath. A child is crying because someone scared him. A child is crying because someone take his toy, and so on. Ideology identifies a unitary object that incorporates complex sets of meanings with the social agents and the processes that produce them. There are no ideologically neutral sign systems. Signs function to persuade as well as to refer. Volosinov declared that whenever a sign is present, ideology is present too. Sign systems help to naturalize and reinforce particular framings of the way things are. Consequently, on these principles, semiotic analysis always involves ideological analysis. Purely structuralist approaches have not addressed processes of textual production or audience interpretation. They have downplayed or even ignored the contingencies of particular practices, institutional frameworks, and cultural, social, economic, and political contexts. The failure of the structuralist semiotics to relate text to social relations has been attributed to its functionalism. Sociologists insist that we must consider not only how signs signify but also why structures are not causes. The creation and interpretation of text must be related to social factors outside the structures of text. Post-structuralism. Post-structuralism is the literary and the philosophical work that both builds upon and rejects ideas within structuralism. Post-structuralism evolved from the structuralist tradition in the late 1960s, seeking to account for the role of social change and the role of the subject. Post-structuralist semiotics has sometimes adopted Marxist and psychoanalytical inflections. Theorists such as Roland Barthes use semiotics for the revelatory political purpose of demystifying society. However, The semiotic decoding and denaturalization of textual and social codes tends to suggest that there is a literal truth or pre-given objective reality underlying decoded version. Post-structuralist theorists have argued that the structuralist enterprise is impossible since we cannot stand outside our science system. While we may be able to bypass one set of conventions, we may never escape the framing of the experience by convention. The notion of codes within the codes spells doom for the structuralist quest of the fundamental and universal underlying structure, but it does not represent the demise of the semiotic enterprise conceived more broadly. Negation of reality might suggest that to build meaning out of such an interpretation, one must assume that the definition of these signs are both valid and fixed. It is criticized by realists as relativism. Such philosophical critics often fear an extreme relativism in which every representation of reality is regarded as being as good as any other. If signs do not merely reflect reality, but are involved in its construction, then those who control the sign systems control the construction of the reality. Since the second half of the 1980s, social semiotics has been adopted as a label by members and associates of the Sydney Semiotic Circle, much influenced by Michael Halliday's language as social semiotics. Social semiotics is a branch of field of semiotics which investigates human signifying practices in specific social and cultural circumstances and which tries to explain meaning-making as a social practice. The Sydney School version of the social semiotics is not a branch of semiotics in the same sense as visual semiotics. It is a brand of semiotics positioned in opposition to traditional semiotics. There is, of course, nothing new about semiotics having a social dimension. The roots of social semiotics can be traced to the early theories. The Sydney School has adopted and adapted some of its analytical concepts partly from the structuralism while defining itself largely in opposition to Saussure analytical priorities. Semiotics has not become widely institutionalized as formal academic discipline and it has not achieved the status of science which Saussure anticipated. Sometimes semioticians present their analysis and some seem to choose examples which illustrates the points they wish to make rather than applying semiotic analysis to an extensive random sample. Few semioticians make their analytical strategy sufficiently explicit for others to apply it either to the example used or to others. Many make no allowance for alternative readings, assuming either that their own interpretation reflects a general consensus or a meaning which resides within the text. There are also elite interpreters who reject the investigation of other people's interpretations privilege. Semioticians do not always make explicit the limitations of their techniques and semiotics is sometimes uncritically presented as a general-purpose tool. Structuralist semiotic analysis is just one of many techniques which may be used to explore sign practices. It is a broad theoretical hypothesis of symbols and signs that packs particularly with their meaning in both synthetically created and natural words, where it is used by scholars and professional researchers as a method to interpret meanings behind symbols and how the meanings are created. Content analysis is defined as a systematic technique for analyzing message content and message handling. It is a tool for observing and analyzing the overt communication behavior of selected communicators. This involves a quantitative approach of the analysis of the manifest content of text and connotative meanings. The primary value of semiotics is central concern for the investigation of meaning-making and representation which conventional academic disciplines have tended to treat as a peripheral. Semiotic analysis has been applied to a vast range of modes and media. Since this involves invading the territory of different academic disciplines, it is understandable that semiotics has often been criticized as imperialistic. Semiotics has an important synthesizing function, seeking to study meaning-making and representation in cultural artifacts and practices of whatever kind on the basis of unified principles. In an increasingly visual age, an important contribution of semiotics from Roland Barthes onwards has been a concern with imagistic as well as linguistic signs, particularly in the context of advertising, photography, and audiovisual media. Semiotics may encourage us not to dismiss a particular medium as less worth than another. We live within an ecology of signs that both reflects and gives shape to our experience. We must identify and recognize the importance of new literacies in this ever-changing semiotic ecology, thinking in ecological terms that the interaction of different semiotic structures and languages led the Tartu School cultural semiotician Yuri Lotman to coin the term semiosphere. Different media and genres provide different frameworks for representing experience, facilitating some forms of expression and inhibiting others. In this, we can observe that there is a growing theoretical interest in multimodality. Multimodality is the combination of different semiotic modes and the application of multiple literacies within one medium. For example, is this video presentation, where you have to understand the language I am using, the written language in this presentation, and the terms that I am uttering, and so on. That's all for today. Thank you for watching and listening. Assalamualaikum.